Hi, this is Ron Cipcic, and this is the third segment of a four-part series on labor market theory. In this particular segment, we're going to pull it all together. We're going to put the supply curve and demand curve together in the same space. We're going to talk about a situation where the market, the labor market, affects the firm, the employer, but the employer does not affect the labor market. In other words, we're going to assume that this firm, this employer, is a wage taker. And once we get this model built, we're going to learn some very important principles. One principle is going to be that there's a hiring rule, that the firm will not hire labor unless the value of the labor, the value of the marginal product of the labor, is greater than the cost of the labor. So we'll be looking at the hiring rule, and then we would like to wrap up the lesson by taking these principles and applying it to the minimum wage. So let's go ahead and review a couple key ideas that we learned in the first two lessons. First of all, the supply curve in the labor market is going to be reflecting the behavior of households or workers. And the demand curve in the labor market is going to be representing the behavior of businesses who are the demanders of labor. The interaction of supply and demand results in an equilibrium wage rate and an equilibrium employment level. Now let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this equilibrium wage rate in this particular market is $9 an hour. We're assuming here there's a very large number of sellers of labor and a very large number of buyers of labor. In other words, this is a competitive labor market. In that case, the wage comes across to the firm, and the firm is actually a wage taker. In other words, if the firm pays the going wage rate, in this case $9 an hour, it can hire as much labor as it chooses. In other words, its supply curve, the supply curve it faces, is perfectly elastic. Now it's important to keep in mind, the firm is not a supplier of labor. The firm is a demander of labor. This supply curve is the supply curve that the firm faces. In other words, what this says is the firm can hire as much labor as it wants in this labor market, so long as it pays the going wage of $9 an hour. If it tries to pay less than $9 an hour, it will not be able to attract any labor. It would go from attracting as much as it wants to attracting nothing. No one would work for this firm if it were paying $7 an hour when everyone else in town is paying the equivalent of $9 an hour for the same work. Of course, on the flip side, the firm would have no incentive to pay a wage above $9 an hour. Any wage up here would be paying workers too much. I can attract as many workers as I want at $9. Why would I pay workers $13 an hour? Okay, so you might imagine a situation, maybe we're talking about low-end sales help, the kind of sales help that works at the mall. When I say low-end, the sales work is not very complicated. It's mainly order taking and light customer service. So say we're in a city where there's literally thousands of people doing that kind of retail work, working in small stores, shops, and so on, just basically doing customer service and taking orders. Well, if there are thousands of people being employed in a particular labor market for $9 an hour, if a new business moves into that area and wants to hire labor, that type of labor, it will only have to pay roughly $9 an hour. So the point is, the firm has no control over the wage rate. The wage rate is determined by market forces, and basically the firm is a wage taker. So the market affects the firm, but the firm does not affect the market. Now look, if the supply curve is horizontal, what I'd like to prove is the supply curve is also representing what we call the marginal factor cost of labor. So let's go ahead, marginal factor cost of labor. So first of all, let's define what marginal factor cost is, show how it's calculated, and then I'll show you why the supply curve and MFC curve are represented by the same line. So what we'll do is we'll scroll down. I've left a little room below these pictures, and not enough, but a little bit of room. And let me go ahead, I'm going to set up a little table here. say the wage rate is here, the employment level is here. This is going to be the total cost of labor, and this is going to be the marginal factor cost, which I'll define in just a minute. So at $9 an hour, we can attract one worker, which means our total cost is $9 an hour. At $9 an hour, we can attract two workers, which means our total cost is $18 an hour. We can hire three workers at $9 an hour. Total cost is $27. Do it one more time. We can hire a fourth worker, four workers at $9 an hour, and this would be $36 an hour. All right, the point I'm trying to make is if you take the wage rate times the employment level, you get the total cost of labor. And so we can multiply these numbers to get these numbers. And what we're showing is the horizontal demand curve. In other words, to hire more labor, the firm does not have to raise its wage. Notice that whether the firm wants to hire 1 unit of labor or 4 times as much labor, it still pays $9 an hour. So the firm does not have to raise its wage to employ more workers. And notice that the firm's decision to hire 1 worker or 4 workers has no feedback effect on the labor market. In other words, each firm is hiring so little labor, its actions have no impact on the market wage. All right? Now, what is marginal factor cost? It's the cost of a particular unit of labor. So how do you calculate it? It's the change in total cost over the change in workers, or L. So when we add the second worker, let's go to the second worker, we go from $9 to $18. We go from 1 worker to 2. So we add what? We add $9 to our cost. We go from 9 to 18. When we add the third worker, we add 9. We add the fourth worker, we add $9 to our total cost. So in other words, the idea here is that the wage rate equals the marginal factor cost. Why? Because I don't have to pay all workers more to hire 1 more unit of labor. Now notice the wage rate and marginal factor cost are not the same. The wage rate is an average. It's what we pay all workers on average. The marginal factor cost, as its name would suggest, is a marginal. It's talking about a particular unit. So what we're saying in this particular market type, in a competitive labor market, the wage rate and the cost of a unit of labor are going to be equal. They're not the same, but they're going to be equal. Okay, so let me just partition this off from what's below it. So if we come back up to the diagram that we had drawn earlier, we see that, let me just this is 9 over here, so let's so this wage rate is 9. So whether the firm wants to hire 1 worker or whether it wants to hire 4 workers, 1 worker or 4 workers or something in between, it's going to pay a wage of 9. What does that mean? That means the cost of each worker is equal to the wage. In other words, I do not have to pay all workers more to hire 1 additional worker, which means the wage rate I pay the additional worker is the cost of that additional worker. So each point on this line represents 2 ideas. This point represents 2 ideas. It represents the idea that the firm pays 4 workers on average $9 an hour, and that point says that the 4th worker adds $9 to my total cost. Okay? So S and MFC are represented by the same line. Now this is not the case in every labor market model. This is the case when the firm is a what? When the firm is a wage taker. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to impose in here a VMP curve. So let's put our VMP curve in, and we're setting up for something very important. If the VMP, if the value of marginal product is greater than MFC, so if VMP is greater than MFC, what should the firm do? The firm should hire the labor. However, if MFC is greater than VMP, if MFC is greater than VMP, then the firm should not hire a particular unit of labor. So we can see then that 4 in our model is a very important employment level. We're going to call this L sub M. And L sub M is the profit maximizing employment level. The profit maximizing employment level. In other words, the firm will only want to hire up to the point where what is true. It'll only want to hire up to the point where VMP equals, notice this point here, VMP equals MFC. So if VMP is greater than MFC, the firm will want to hire. If MFC is greater than VMP, the firm will not want to hire. So only units of labor up to the point where VMP equals MFC are viable units of labor. Units outside that range are not viable. Okay? So we have a very important hiring rule now. Let's go ahead and we'll scale down. And coming down to a new model down here. So let's write out this hiring rule. Hire, firm should hire what? Hire so long as VMP is greater than or equal to MFC. This is simply marginal analysis. We've talked about marginal analysis throughout the course. A student should go to class if the student believes the benefit of going to class is greater than the cost. A company should make a gadget if they believe the benefit of making the gadget is greater than the cost of making the gadget, if MR is greater than MC. What we're learning now is a gadget company should only hire a unit of gadget labor if the value of that worker, VMP, is greater than the cost of that worker. So this is just another case of what we call marginal analysis. And we see that economic actors, economic decision makers, only will want to do something if the what? Benefit is greater than the what? Greater than the cost. Okay? Very, very important idea. All right. Well, let's do an application and apply what we just learned to a labor market. Let's assume for the sake of argument that this is an unskilled teenage labor market, that let's say that this is a market where the labor in this market is not very skilled, eager but not skilled. And let's say that in a particular town, the going market wage rate is $9 an hour for unskilled teenage labor. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the government steps in and in the interest of boosting wages and boosting incomes, the government imposes a price floor or a wage floor at $14 an hour. So everyone in this labor market is legally required to be paid a minimum of $14 an hour. This is a floor. And we've studied this in one of our earlier lessons. This is actually a price control. This is actually a price floor. So let's go ahead and note that. This is a price floor. Okay? So legally, businesses may not pay below $14 an hour. Now, as we learned earlier in the course, this is going to decrease the amount of labor demanded. So the amount of labor demanded is going to decrease, and now we understand why. If the wage rate is raised, marginal productivity doesn't change. If businesses can't pass the higher wage on in the way of higher prices, then companies have an incentive to demand less labor. Fewer units of labor are going to be profitable. On the other hand, if you promise workers $14 an hour, they're going to be more inclined to work than if you promise them $9. So the amount of labor supplied is going to increase, which is going to create what? A surplus of labor, which is greater unemployment. So we've already learned this. In fact, we not only covered this, but we talked about the welfare effects. If you recall, we put A here, B here, C here, D here, E here, and we talked about how consumer surplus and producer surplus were affected, and we talked about how there was a deadweight loss equal to C in area E. Okay? Now, that's not really what we want to talk about. What I want to do today is talk about the impact on the firm. So this wage rate, $14 an hour, comes across. What does that do? That raises the SMFC curve. So the SMFC curve moves upward, which means the cost of labor has increased. Notice we're assuming marginal productivity and the price of the final product are being held constant. We have not shifted the VMP curve. The VMP curve is being held constant. So what happens? The firm is going to have an incentive to hire less labor. All right? So now we have come full circle. We've tied in the market effect on the firm, and we've been able to show that the higher cost will encourage the firm to employ fewer people. Okay? Again, policymakers are often very well-meaning. They want to raise incomes, they want to boost the incomes of poor people, they want to help disadvantaged workers live better. And who can be against that? That's like world peace. Okay? I've never talked to anyone who is against the idea of a worker bettering themselves. All right, the point is, if the government imposes a wage, though, that is disconnected, that has no connection to marginal productivity and the price of the final product, when you impose higher wages on employers, you force them to have to recalculate the optimal level of employment. And many companies will have to lay off workers and probably replace labor with capital. When you raise the wage rate, you're basically making capital seem more attractive. And it's important to realize the number one job killer in the world is not, the number one job killer in the United States is not foreign companies or Chinese workers. That's a myth. The number one job killer in the world is advancing technology. This technology that we use and love today, and that most of us employ in great quantities, cell phones and sophisticated smart cars and all sorts of home electronics that make our life very convenient and easy, all sorts of services that are highly automated, banking services and even food services, all these things. This technology, which makes our life so easy, also makes it easy for employers to replace mundane, low-level labor with machinery and with automation, which is the use of machines to run machines, and mechanization, which is the use of machines. So what puts low-skilled workers out of work today? It's machinery. It's automation. And this trend is not decreasing, it's increasing. So if you look at, for instance, manufacturing employment around the world, you're seeing manufacturing employment decline everywhere, even in places like China. So America worries about manufacturing employment going to China in places where the labor costs are very, very low, or relatively low compared to America. But even in China, China is looking for ways to use fewer workers in mundane or routine production processes. All right? So actually manufacturing employment is declining in places like China because it's declining all over the world. We're moving away from processes where we use human beings to do mundane, mindless work. This ought to be good news to human beings. Most human beings would find that work to be terribly boring. And a lot of times you have to pay people a lot to do things that make them miserable. It also leads to self-medication, that when people are so bored and feel like the work they're doing is so mindless and meaningless, they tend to medicate. They're more likely to drink. They're more likely to use drugs. The point I'm trying to make is in a world where society is no longer valuing low-skilled work, if you force higher wages on employers, you only accelerate the process. You encourage places like McDonald's and places like that to automate even more. There'll be a day where fast food will largely be delivered by machines. I mean, that day is already here, but raising minimum wages on fast food workers is only going to accelerate the decline of employment in the fast food industry. So again, good intentions, but the results aren't very pretty. Okay, let's wrap it up here. In our next lesson, we're actually going to look at factors that shift the supply curve and demand curve for labor, and we'll look at the effects on wages and employment levels.